we set this up as a workshop rather than as a public meeting because we really wanted a chance to get into a lot of the details of what happened, uh, learn a lot of those things, and also have kind of a good brainstorming session on what can be done now. And our intent was to think down the road about having something that was a public forum because there really is a lot of interest. Uh, and I think even just having this recording will be very helpful in advertising something. So, first of all, I really want to thank you people for finding the time to come on. This is exciting for us. We're going to open with just a couple of brief comments on just explaining what Green Jobs Oshawa is and what it's been doing.
This is Hillary.
Oh, okay. I'll just wait a second for Phil to sit down.
Everyone's in. Yeah. Well, this is the meeting. We're all online. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll ask. There was an email came round today from Matthew with the
Hi, Simon.
Came through earlier today.
Hi,
Tiffany. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Sam. Hi, everyone.
Look at this one from Matthew. But I'll tell them now you're trying to get them. Okay. Hillary's trying to get in.
Okay.
But she was trying to get in on yesterday's Zoom meeting address. And I've suggested that she tries again on the one that Matthew's just sent round today.
Okay.
But she is trying to get in. If you can, whoever's controlling it can keep an eye out for her.
Yeah. I used yesterday's email from Tony and didn't have any problem, but I know that Hillary will find a way of having a bit of a problem.
Again, you know her so well.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just saying that we'll start with just an introduction from Green Jobs Oshawa about what we've been doing, and Tony and Rebecca will take about 10 minutes to do that. And then we're going to have Phil make the main presentation on Lucas and just give us the background on that. I'll just introduce the four people from England in a second. And then Hillary is going to follow and just tell us a little bit shorter about the Greater London Council and how that overlapped, but also was in the same spirit of this question of democracy and worker-led restructuring. And then we'll have the general free-flowing discussion, and that can go anywhere where people are interested. And I guess we can take 2 hours, however much time people want. Let me just say who's here from England. Phil Asquith, who was on who was a steward at the time, chartered engineer, was led the Combine Committee in Lancashire, which was 3,500 workers, the second largest one, and has been a major spokesman all along. What's special about Phil, in a sense, is he's a white-collar worker who was leading very much of a blue-collar fight, or at least very much the inclusion of blue-collar workers. And I think that's an interesting sideline of this, which is so important to examine. Workers are going to do this. They're going to need a lot of skills that they haven't been trained for. So having these kinds of alliances is very important. So that's one thing we'll want to hear about. John Rutley was also a steward at the time, and John he's retiree. He's very active in unison around retirees, local issues, Labour Party issues, international issues. And I hope John will just feel free once we get into the discussion to jump in at any time and elaborate, contradict, whatever. And we also have, I should say, and Hillary, anybody who's interested in the question of democracy administrative democracy, municipal democracy, workers' control will come across Hillary at some point or another. And she hasn't just been an intellectual writing about this, of which she's written an enormous amount, but she's really been to all these places and studied them and been a researcher involved. And she was part of the team that took over the Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone in the early 80s. Lucas was in the around 76. So she'll be here. And Samantha Mason works for Public Sector Union, the Public and Commercial Services Union, one of the larger public sector unions in the UK. And what's exciting about Samantha's involvement is that even though this is a public sector union, and people have seen a lot of the questions of conversion as revolving around private sector unions, although Hillary's done a little bit on public sector, Samantha's been a staff person for the public service who's really focused on the New Lucas project, on keeping this idea alive and asking how it applies. And the union has, not only committed her time, they've done pamphlets on it. So again, it's an example of the public sector, private sector relationship through all of this and its potential. So why don't we just get started with Phil and people. We can deal with this pretty flexibly. And I don't know, with Phil, I thought you might take 25 minutes, half an hour. Does that seem okay?
It'll be less than that, but
okay.
I'm aiming for about 20.
Okay, great. Okay, go for it, Phil.
Okay, well, it's great to meet everyone, and thank you for your invitation.
Oh, I'm sorry, Phil. Phil,
yeah, I think you've missed your team starting off first.
Yes, sorry, Tony and Rebecca. Can we just? I was just getting into it too quickly. Tony and Rebecca, why don't you just do your introductions to who we are first of all, so the guests know.
Yeah, Rebecca and I talked about this, and I got outvoted, so I'm going to do a brief introduction. Okay. The Green Jobs Oshawa group really was motivated by General Motors' announced plant closure in Oshawa in the fall of 2018. And there was growing sense going into 2019 that the campaign that was being conducted by our national union, Unifor, was weak, was likely to be ineffective, and was not dealing with some of the issues that some of us felt were really critical, including a growing demand for nationalizing the plant if GM was not going to stay after making profits in Oshawa for over 100 years. And out of that grew Green Jobs Oshawa. Some of the workers from the plant, the local labor council, people who were involved in climate justice, people from the community, all came together around this idea of repurposing the plant, converting it to something that was more in keeping with the demands of the climate crisis, that would satisfy the demands of workers who had been fighting against concessions and two-tier agreements, and maintain jobs and productive capacity in the community. We, as part of our campaign, commissioned a feasibility study which showed that the plant could be converted to the production of battery electric vehicles for government fleets, such as post office vehicles or other necessary vehicles that would have a positive impact on reducing carbon emissions, would maintain jobs, would be able to get rid of a two-tier system in the plant and have workers getting decent wages and conditions, and would maintain thousands of jobs in the community, and would be able to break even on a commercial basis within a few years. So that was really the core of our organizing through about a year. In the course of that, the National Union made an agreement with General Motors to maintain about 300 jobs in the plant out of the thousands that were there prior to their announced closure. And then by the end of 2019, vehicle production was ended. So we were continuing that campaign. We, of course, faced a number of obstacles. We felt that there was actually surprising amount of publicity and support that was gained from some sectors of from the labor movement, from climate organizations. It really seemed to resonate quite a bit across the country and beyond. That was the strengths of it, but it was difficult for us to really mobilize workers from the plant or the community, largely because our national union leadership and even the local leadership was hostile to our organizing efforts. And that's a really difficult obstacle to overcome when you're trying to mobilize workers. We hoped for stronger response from political organizations. Obviously, the Liberal Party, Conservative Party in Canada, which are corporate parties, were not at all interested in our goals or our program, but we got a disappointing response from the Social Democratic Party of Canada, the NDP. The local provincial member of parliament worked with us to some extent, but was cautious or reluctant to endorse public ownership in any kind of forthright way. We were able to get the provincial NDP convention to endorse our goals, but the leadership did not pick that up. The federal party, even though they were in the midst of a federal election in the fall of 2019, was not willing to support our issue or try to make a political issue out of it in the election campaign. And we did get support from two leadership candidates for the Green Party of Canada, which is a relatively minor party. It has 3 members in the federal parliament. But those candidates, one of them dropped out of the race, and the other one ran a really strong campaign, but came second in the leadership of for the leadership of the Green Party. Dimitri Lascaris ran on an eco-socialist platform and really did support our the Green Jobs Oshawa program. So there's I think some really positive potential there, but none of it translated into the kind of massive campaign that we would have needed to really make an impact on getting political attention or public attention on taking the plant over from General Motors. Getting into 2020 with the advent of the pandemic that we've all been dealing with for the past year and a bit, we saw that as an opportunity to demand that the productive capacity and laid off workers in Oshawa be used to produce PPE, in particular masks. And there was a tremendous need for PPE and in particular N95 respirator masks in Canada, as there was in a number of countries. And we were able, over a course of a few weeks, to build quite a bit of public support for that, the result of which was that GM agreed to set up surgical mask production in the plant, recalled 60 laid off workers who are still producing surgical masks. They never agreed to manufacture N95 masks, which would have been more significant. But then in the fall of 2020, in the union negotiations with GM, GM announced that they were returning vehicle production to Oshawa and are tooling up to do that now and should be launching pickup truck manufacturing by this fall, which basically makes our political demand for taking over the plant and converting it to more socially beneficial production really takes that off the table for the time being. So I think that what is really hopeful to us in trying to learn from your experiences and generalize from them is trying to figure out our way forward for the group that we have, which we know has great potential and has garnered a lot of interest and support both in the Oshawa community and more broadly, to try to figure out how we come up with a revised political program which is really centered on working class issues in our community, that really positions us to continue to build support from workers in taking on corporations like GM, and combines that with a broader vision, which includes much greater emphasis on the need for public ownership if we're going to transform our economy and our society. And so those are the issues that are very much on our minds right now, in trying to figure out how we move forward as Green Jobs Oshawa. And we're really excited and hopeful to learn from your experiences and find out how that can help us figure out our direction going forward. Thank you all for joining us today.
That was great, Tony. Thanks. Okay, Phil, this time we'll let you go right in. Go ahead. I think you're muted.
You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the classic mistake, isn't it? First of all, thanks for the invitation to speak today. I was just saying when we were chatting before the meeting started that I've driven past Oshawa quite a lot, which I believe a lot of tourists do. But I've never been there. This was in 1969 when I was working for 3 months in Toronto in my university vacation. And as well as enjoying Canada, there are two things that stand out in my mind from the visit. One, I watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon from Toronto City Square. And the second thing, which is probably more of an impact, was I turned down an invitation to go to the Woodstock Pop Festival, which at that time was billed as being quite a small and modest event. So I have some familiarity with Ontario. Okay, so as Sam said, I was chairman of the Burnley site of the Lucas Aerospace Combine Shop Stewards Committee. And this employed 3,500 of the 15,000 Lucas Aerospace workers in the UK. The biggest plant in Lucas Aerospace was in Birmingham, where John was very active in the Lucas Combine at Lucas Aerospace on the Birmingham site. So I've been involved with the Lucas plant since its conception in 1975, and then a little time before that with the Combine Shop Stewards Committee. What I'm going to say tonight is actually going to go into a bit more detail than I normally would on the philosophy of the plan, because of the nature of the gathering, and not so much into the products themselves. But we can pick that up in discussion if you want to. When we launched the plan in July 1976, none of us ever dreamt that we would be speaking about it at conferences over 40 years later. And this renaissance has been driven by the new Lucas Plan Working Group, who organised a conference in 2016 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the launch of the plan. And subsequently, Steve Sprung, an independent filmmaker, has made several films about the plan itself, which are accessible online. I'm sure the main reason that the plan's maintained its currency is that the problems which we were addressing in the 70s were essentially the same problems as the ones which confront us today, only writ larger and so much more urgent. So what I'm going to do, as requested, is to describe the circumstances which led to the plan, the philosophy behind the plan, and its political reception and its international reception. Why do a plan in the first place? In the late 60s and 1970s, jobs were hemorrhaging from the British economy. The industrial landscape was a mess. Our Prime Minister of the day, Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, his favourite white heat of the technological revolution simply was burning up jobs and creating the new phenomenon of structural unemployment. You'll remember, well, some of you will remember, not all of you looking at the screen, in the early 1970s, the energy crisis led to the quadrupling of oil prices. And in the second election of 1974, a Labour government was elected on a manifesto which included defence cuts. Now, in Lucas Aerospace, 70% of the work was military, so that rang the alarm bells about future job cuts in Lucas. Before I go much further, I want to say a little bit about the structure of the Lucas Aerospace Combine Shop Stewards Committee, because without the Combine, there would have been no Lucas plan. The Combine was formed and consolidated over the late 60s and 70s as a direct result of the Byzantine complexity of the official British trade union movement and its inability to offer effective resistance to this wholesale industrial upheaval, job loss and globalization. The Combine represented 17 Lucas Aerospace plants in 14 geographical locations, 18,000 members, and at least 6 manual and 3 staff unions. So the Combine was able to coordinate action across the plants in a way that the official trade union structure wasn't. The trade union structure was still based on the 19th century craft. So the Combine tended to be proactive rather than reactive. And it had been described, in fact, by Hillary as a subtitle to her book on the Lucas Plan, as a new trade unionism in the making. The Combine was industrially powerful because it could take action which would ground aircraft at Heathrow for the following day. But because we were a proactive organisation, I always sort of felt if we had to resort to traditional industrial action, we would have failed somewhat. But it was a powerful industrial organisation, as well as a forward-thinking organisation. In January 1974, given this industrial landscape I've just painted of job loss, the meeting focused on what would our strategy be to protect our members' jobs in the wake of what was happening and in the wake of the likely defence cuts ahead promised by the Labour government. We had long debates and we looked at the various strategies which were being implemented by industrial workers then, such as nationalisation, factory occupations like upper-clad shipbuilders, work-ins, campaigns for the retention of existing product lines, and none of those seemed appropriate to us. We felt that a struggle based on the continued manufacture of products that no one wanted was ultimately doomed to failure, unsustainable, and this applied particularly to the weapons industry. So we decided to request a meeting with the government's Secretary of State for Industry, Tony Benn, who has always been a darling of the Labour left, to discuss the manifesto commitment to nationalisation of the aerospace industry and the proposed defence cuts. In 1974, the Combine Shop Stewards Committee had an unprecedented meeting with Tony Benn. I say unprecedented because it was 2.5 hours in length, when if you were lucky, you usually got half an hour. There were no national trade union officials and no civil servants. And for that reason, the national officials made sure that was the first and last time such a meeting happened. Do you get a flavour of what's coming next? Ben explained that he didn't have the legislative power to nationalise the aerospace components industry. And given the long lead times associated with defence products, the Combine should look at planning alternative industrial strategies and products using our members' skills in the process and looking at the facilities around us. In other words, do an audit of the whole operation and see what we would make instead. Now, on the surface of it, this could look like a straightforward diversification of industry model. But as I'll go on, you'll see it was a lot deeper than that. Ben also offered a tripartite meeting to discuss the future of Lucas Aerospace and jobs involving the directors of Lucas Aerospace. I'll return to that in a few minutes. So the Combine meeting a couple of months later, after the Christmas, we met in January 1975 to discuss what we should do about Tony Benn's advice. And there were a lot of discussions. We were feeling our way. We went around in a few circles. But then it was brought to a conclusion by two contributions, one by Ron Mills, who was the Combine Liaison Officer who kept everyone informed. And I'm quoting from Hillary's book here, because it really is worth quoting this piece. Ron said in the debate that the problem that constantly faces trade unionists is that when they work to the same criteria as the company's accountants, their impact is marginal as they become part of the crisis rather than the victims of the crisis. A workers' corporate plan would become marginalised too, unless we work to radically different and unorthodox criteria. More debate. And towards the end of the debate, our late friend and colleague, and in some ways our spiritual leader, Mike Cooley, who died a few months ago, brought together the sentiments of many of the Combine speakers in the debate. And again, quoting Mike from Hillary's book, I'm not on a commission deal, by the way. The only way in which we could be involved in a corporate plan would be if we grew it in a way which challenged the private profit motive of the company and instead talked of social profit. If we talked of socially useful products, what would be said then? The only way we could do this would be to be completely independent of the company. And suddenly the clouds lifted and the way forward became clear. And at that point, we rejected the notion of meeting in a tripartite fashion with the company, as Ben had suggested. So, as I said, the way forward suddenly became clear, or more clear, not totally clear. The Combine decided to draw up an alternative to the company's corporate plan independently. If defence workers' skills were no longer required to make weapons, they should be used to benefit society. This was consistent with decades of Labour Party and trade union policy, but no one had ever planned the nuts and bolts of the conversion process. Now, if this is beginning to sound a bit idealistic, just let me put it in context of the Labour manifesto again. Labour was pledged to make a fundamental and irreversible shift in power towards working people. So it sounded as when they went into office as though they meant business. So this would be a plan to save jobs by making products to fulfill the unmet needs of society, products to be measured by their use value rather than their exchange value. We talked of social profit from socially useful products. We wish to democratize technology and use it to liberate people rather than enslave them on production lines. After all, the definition of profit on weapons contracts was and still is, I believe, purely political. Let me give you an example of that by talking about kidney dialysis machines. Lucas Aerospace, believe it or not, at one of our plants in London, in Neasden, actually made kidney machines, and the company were planning to shut it down at a time when 3,500 people were dying each year for want of a kidney machine. And when we asked the company why they wanted to close this facility, they said, we make more profit on weapons systems than we do on kidney machines. And our response was, well, hang on a minute. The National Health Service buy kidney machines funded by the taxpayer. The taxpayers pay for weapons. So it's the same customer. So who decides what's profitable, kidney machines or military equipment? And it was a purely political definition of profit, which was at work there. Following that, we took the resolution from the Combine meeting to every site, explained what we were intending doing to our members at the old-fashioned traditional open-air mass meetings, and we received the endorsement of our members to set work to draw up the alternative plan. Over a year, we consulted the workforce and some sympathetic experts and academics, and it was a long and strenuous process. Most of the academics who'd talked and written about this for years, who we approached for help, were actually no help whatsoever, but the ones that did help us were magnificent. We then did really what we should have done in the first place. The Combine executive devised a questionnaire which was sent to each of the Lucas Aerospace Shop Stewards committees around the group, asking them to audit their facilities, machine tools, skills, and the rest of it, and to consider what we could make instead. The result was quite amazing. From some sites, we got very little. From some sites, we were swamped. But the outcome was dozens of alternative products, which we shortlisted into 6 product groupings. Now, I want to stress at this point that we aren't claiming that the product ideas were unique. Some of the products had been around for years, like the road rail vehicle, which is still in operation in Canada and North America, but we saw a particular use for them in the UK and the Third World. So we weren't claiming patent rights on the products. We were claiming access to products that we could actually work and manufacture realistically in Lucas Aerospace. So the 6 product groupings that we had included renewables, energy conservation, medical equipment, transport technology, and oceanics. And if you read the corporate plan, which you can see on lucasplan.org.uk, you'll see that the products listed include hybrid car engines, electric cars, road rail vehicle I've just mentioned, wind turbines, solar technology, fuel cells, heat pumps, microprocessors, which we now call chips, of course, and high performance kidney machines. When we presented the plan to the management, they were quite derisory. They viewed the products, which I guess were futuristic then. They said that these were from the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade. I think they meant hippies, but they're technologies which, of course, every day now. And in fact, if you read the company's response to the corporate plan, it includes a statement on wind turbines that they foresaw no large-scale market for wind turbines. So I never apologise for saying that our members got it right in terms of future planning, and the company got it wrong. The plan was a gift to the peace movement because it was the first time that there were concrete alternatives to arms production posed. It was the first time ever, as far as we knew, and it was a great help in removing jobs from the disarmament debate, because you'll know whenever there's a threat of a weapons cancellation, the whole campaign is about the number of jobs, not whether the nation state needs the weapon on grounds of security. And I think partly for that reason, the Combine was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, which we didn't get, but I'll return to that later on. The plan was not just about products, but the plan also challenged the way in which products are designed and produced, where skill and creativity are designed out of the production process in a Tayloristic way. Taylor was the father of scientific management, or the production line. We proposed a reversal of this to human-centered production systems to develop the skill and creativity of our members, rather than to extract it from the production and the design process. So in all of this, it was axiomatic that we were challenging the misuse and abuse of science and technology. We believe that science and technology are not fixed point and they aren't given, that their use is directed and for too long away from the socially useful economy. The plan also challenged design for built-in obsolescence, products designed to wear out prematurely, fueling a throwaway society with all of the wastage of the planet's resources that engenders. It was clear even then that a world economy based on endless growth could not be sustained by the Earth. So what was the reaction to the plan? The international reaction to the plan took us completely by surprise and was overwhelming and completely supportive. And we were swamped with requests for speakers at meetings and conferences in the UK, Europe, Australia, America, and Scandinavia. What did the press make of it? Well, you might think that this quote comes from a left-wing periodical, but I'll tell you the source of it in a moment. It says the document is clearly worth consideration by management, for it demonstrates clearly that if managers don't carry out their jobs to the satisfaction of workers, then those same workers have the capability and know how to do it for them. That was from Industrial Management magazine in 1976. And I think that rather took the company by surprise. The Financial Times said about the plan, it's one of the most advanced yet prepared in the UK by a group of shop stewards, and one of the most radical alternative plans ever drawn up by workers for their company. And the Engineer magazine said the plan was a 20th century version of the Industrial Revolution. So it's praise indeed from the press, which is not normally sympathetic to British trade unionists. Amongst all of this overwhelming and positive response, there was one King Canute-like exception, which was our side, our being in inverted commas, which was the responsible national trade union officials and the Labour government. They were fearful at that time of a wave of grassroots trade union activism, and they dismissed the plan, and they formed an unholy alliance between the three of them, Lucas management, the Labour government, Tony Benn had been moved by this time, and the national officials. And they gave Lucas as a company more taxpayers' money to destroy even more jobs. And this was despite the fact that the Labour Party conference had voted unanimously to support the Lucas worker at its annual conference. I was there and I saw it. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes coming to a few conclusions. We're often asked whether we thought the plan succeeded or failed because the company not only wouldn't they manufacture the products, they broke off negotiations with the Combine altogether, saying that we were an unofficial organisation. Although the Combine members were democratically elected by their own unions, when we all came together to coordinate activity, we were suddenly deemed unofficial, and the company and the national officials pounced on that to marginalise us as an organisation. So in conclusion, succeed or fail, our side, the Labour government and the national trade unions, certainly failed us, that's for sure. On the positive side, we're still talking about the issues in the plan 40 years later. And we think the plan's made a significant contribution to the conversion, environmental and humanising technology debate. The workers who produced a bottom-up strategy were proven right, and management, the Labour government and many of the trade union establishment were wrong. The company always used to say the best guarantee for the protection of jobs was to stick with the existing product line. Well, the name Lucas Aerospace and its parent company, Lucas Industries, disappeared from the industrial landscape over 25 years ago, whilst we're still here soldiering on. And John has some magnificent photographs of the sites of old Lucas factories, where there's nothing but rubble now and housing estates. Where I worked in Burnley is now a housing estate, and it used to be a research centre for jet engine technology. So, along with the rejection of the plan, things which are commonplace now, like hybrid engines and wind turbines, are all manufactured overseas. And that for us is the familiar story of British industry. Had the plan been accepted, we could maybe be manufacturing in this country our own design of hybrid engines, wind turbines and so on, and enjoyed a couple of decades more of lower CO2 emissions. But despite repeated threats by the company, there were no compulsory redundancies in Lucas Aerospace over the years of the plan campaign. So indeed, that was the initial objective of the plan, to safeguard jobs. I want to finish by returning to what I said about the Nobel Peace Prize. We were nominated for that, but didn't get it. But there is a prize which is often referred to as the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, and that's called the Right Livelihood Foundation. And Mike Cooley accepted the Right Livelihood Award on behalf of the Combine in Stockholm in 1982, I think it was. And Mike's acceptance speech to the gathering in Stockholm made this very memorable point, which I think is what summarizes what all this is about. The last point I want to make is that science and technology are not given. Science and technology is not like the sun or the moon or the stars. It was made by people like us, and if it's not doing for us what we want, we have a right and responsibility to change it. What we've got to remember is that the future is not out there waiting to be discovered, like the storybooks tell us America was waiting for Columbus to discover. The future is yet to be built by people like you and I and our children. We do have real choices. It can be a future in which we are not threatened with mass annihilation through nuclear weapons or ravaged with hunger. It could really be a world in which we treasure our people equally and get science and technology to serve our people rather than the other way around. In a sentence, we could begin to perform the modern miracle. We could help to make the blind see, the lame walk, and we could feed the hungry. And I think that summarizes what all of this has been about. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was just excellent. Very much appreciated. I think maybe Hillary, if you could just overlap with us a bit and give us a sense of where the GLC fits in, and then we could go into questions. And I just want to reemphasize that when we go into questions, I'd really like John to jump in and respond to questions that I'm sure there'll be questions about the participation of workers at the beginning, et cetera. And I'd very much like to hear from you, John. And Sam, you've been doing so much terrific work about keeping this alive and keeping this message alive. And it'd be great for you to tell us about how that's going and catching up on that. But first, Hillary, could you just take a little bit of time and tell us both about the GLC and how it's in the same spirit of what we've just been listening to?
Yes, okay. I'll be quick and then answer anything in the discussion. So, firstly, in a way, what I'm saying is it builds on what how Phil ended, because Phil's quote from Mike explains why the plan, had such a long-lasting impact, and why the GLC, the Labour, the left, it was a sort of left part of the Labour Party in London that after the defeat of the Tony Benn sort of led left nationally, felt that there was an opportunity by taking over the Greater London Council, which, for those that don't know, because it's now been abolished, it was abolished by Mrs. Thatcher because, in a way, it was a political threat. But it actually was meant to be a part of British government. It was very big, because it was expanded from being the London Council to being the Greater London Council, which was an important redistributive move by the left, by the Labour Party. I wouldn't say the left particularly, but just mainstream Labour in 1945, when, in a way, by expanding it, it was more redistributed, because then you could take into account all the suburbs, the richer areas, and redistribute through the rate system to inner city, poorer areas. Anyway, so it was a large body with a budget, as big as many countries. It was a really significant organization in terms of both budget and strategic powers. It wasn't delivering services, but it had power over planning, and it had a most important power, which I think it goes back to the plague or something, where it could act in the interests of all or some of the people of London. And that was using an extra tuppence on the rate for everybody. So that was a large budget, and we used that very liberally, because generously is perhaps the right word, very boldly, because it wasn't a power, there wasn't a power of economic intervention. That was something we developed. I mean, originally the economics of the GLC were kind of pretty neoliberal. I mean, we created this body called the Popular Planning Unit, which I'll explain in a bit in the context of the Lucas tradition. But we came into our offices, which were a sort of old showroom, and the leaflets we found were advertising London in terms of its very low wage levels, so that there were leaflets comparing London with other capitals, showing the wage levels were the lowest, and therefore it was a good place to invest in. So we were reversing all that. Now, the relationship with Lucas is that this left Labour group were very inspired by the Lucas plan, and indeed their whole industrial strategy, which was agreed in the manifesto that was put to the people of London, so it had a democratic mandate, was based on the Lucas plan. And there were three key components, which I'll explain. Plus, I was employed, and I was employed actually as a job share, though in the end, well, very quickly it became full-time. So I'm just starting to turn off my heater. There were three key components of the ways in which we took the idea of the plan forward in the context of local government or capital, big municipal government. Firstly, public investment. So we created an enterprise board. I mean, again, we did have a lot of money. So this is, I'm not sure how applicable it is to smaller local authorities, but in some ways it is, because we used every possible power, not just investment, but public procurement. But investment was key. So we created this enterprise board. And then our relationship to private companies, that at that point, this was the early 80s, so there were a lot of closures, redundancies, rationalizations. It was a time when British industry, as in the late 70s, was rationalizing and cutting in response to the competitive pressures from a reconstructed Germany, as well as other international pressures. So our approach in the enterprise board was to, I mean, I wasn't directly involved in the enterprise board, but the approach was to support companies that were facing redundancies and, invest in them, give them a subsidy, but only on condition that they negotiated with us, but also with their workers through their union around alternative plans for the company. So we used our investment power as a direct stimulus to and support for workers to develop alternatives. So that was using investment as a power on the side of Labour. Secondly, we had an alliance with the unions across London. Now, the unions at that point were beginning to be weakened by the sort of neoliberal policies of Thatcher, but they still had some residual powers. But we worked with them, particularly around, and this was in a way the job of the Popular Planning Unit, which was the unit that I coordinated, and its job was really to support workers and communities to develop alternative plans, based on the model of the Lucas plan, that belief in the capacities and knowledge, practical knowledge, not necessarily theoretical, codifiable knowledge, but practical knowledge which was best expressed through actual plans, actual concrete plans, sometimes prototypes, projects, alternative plans, both in the factory, in the workplace, and in the community. And for this, we had several parts to the work. One was using GLC money to support workers to get time off, because there wasn't always the power to negotiate. For example, I particularly worked with workers in the furniture industry, which was collapsing, and we helped to enable those shop stewards to get time off with their agreement in response to their kind of demand, in a way. They wanted time. We've made quite a big issue of time, calculating the time that corporate planners had, to plan, versus the time scarcity facing workers. So we tried to to liberate that time and then provide trade union tutors who could then draw on any resources that were available. Like we had a research team that was researching furniture markets and so on. So they would come and be a resource, not lecturers, but just a resource to supplement the workers' own knowledge. So workers would come from across the different companies. So it wasn't based on companies, but on a sector. And so that would happen also in relation to the public sector. So underground workers, metro workers, other groups of workers also would have similar kind of workshops. And then the third component of drawing from the Lucas Plan, which was particularly Mike Cooley's idea, and this actually ran through the philosophy of the Lucas Plan, was this idea that locked inside academia, and maybe this was a result of learning the lesson of that first phase that Phil outlined, where they went to universities to get support and only got a few people to volunteer. But their approach was that there was all this capacity, research capacity, including technical capacity, that could be and should be, because it was funded by the public, should be available to working class people. So Mike created these, working with sympathetic people in the educational institutions across London. He created these technology networks, which were part funded and supported by the GLC and part by the university. So the GLC used its support as a kind of lever to open up the resources of the university. So there was an energy technology network which would support alternative energy products, an IT network which supported, for example, a women's IT project, an IT cooperative. And then there was a transport technology centre that including supported the production of electric bikes. And there were several others. And this was a crucial development, which, in the end, abolition sort of stopped all this. I mean, abolition, Norman Tebbit, Thatcher's right-hand man, he made a speech in the United States, so it didn't really get reported much in Britain. But he said, this is modern socialism and we must kill it. And this, in the sense in which it was modern socialism, is that it was the opposite of that sort of Fabian social engineering, which presumed that only the experts, the civil servants and the politicians and the academics knew what was in the interest of the people. And instead, the GLC was saying, actually, it's the knowledge of the people of London that need to be unlocked and supported. So that the GLC turned from being a very alienated institution that people would never go to, except when they were, having to deal with some reprimand or their tax demand or their local tax demand. But it became this kind of open institution. So in its 22 miles of corridors, you just meet, different groups of unemployed people, women's groups looking for grants, people from Docklands coming to discuss their policies. Every possible group would feel the GLC was theirs. It was like a sort of central London resource centre. The other thing that happened was that a lot of these ideas about alternative planning, in a way, it was like a sort of development of the Lucas Plan, became not appropriated, but used for local planning. So there was a very central part of inner city London, Coin Street, by the river, which a property developer had its eyes on and was bought it actually, and was going to eliminate all the inner city housing, inner city small businesses. And the GLC used its compulsory purchase powers to buy it back for the public. But instead of saying, okay, we'll plan it, we'll develop it, it handed over these powers and the control of the land to a local community group that had fought the speculator. And similarly in Docklands, where Thatcher had got rid of all the local planning powers, and there was a Docklands Development Corporation that was supporting an inner city airport. The local people fought the airport, and then the GLC supported them developing a people's plan for the Royal Docks, which did, I mean, it wasn't entirely successful, but it influenced the inspectorate about the airport and weakened it imposed regulations on the airport that the developers didn't really like. And second, it led to lots of local projects. So anyway, this was a kind of afterlife for the GLC that I think has helped to keep, the idea of it going in the 40 years that followed. And so now, in a way, it's an idea that applies to the broader concept of popular planning. So not just enterprises or even sectors, but a broader vision, which I think is important in countering the idea that competition is the way forward, and we have to comply with the sort of competitive agenda of corporations.
Great. Terrific, Hilary. Thank you very much. And that overlaps both with Lucas, obviously, but it also overlaps with our own struggle to figure out what we can do municipally, even though it's such a different context than yours. Why don't we have some questions? I'm just thinking maybe we could, sorry about the phone. Maybe we could have some questions for roughly half an hour. I'd like to leave the last 20 minutes to half an hour to looking, just having some kind of discussion about where we might go from here and getting Samantha particularly involved. But let's just start with people asking specific questions about Lucas and the GLC. And we'll take a few questions, and then you and John and Phil can maybe respond to them. So I don't know if I've got a whole map of everybody. Are there any questions anybody'd like to start with? Anybody? Am I missing anybody? No?
It's Herman.
Herman?
Herman, yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Herman.
Unmute, Herman, unmute.
Sorry, I'm always doing that to other people. What a hypocrite. Two questions, sort of. One is the Greater London Council, was it, we're talking about a group of people that are elected as city councillors from different parts of London that collectively make those policies. And secondly is what attempts were made to take the Lucas model to other industrial places, particularly across the UK, but also, I guess, Europe, but particularly in the UK, considering the similar situations that were happening. So, by the way, it's wonderful to hear this. Get all these ideas when you hear this about what we should be thinking about here. So, anyway, thanks.
Yeah, can I just ask, following up Herman, what was happening in industries like steel when they saw something like this? Did this generate excitement about trying it, or we were just not at that point? And I'd also like to hear more from maybe Phil and John about who was really leading this from below. How involved were rank and file workers? Was it a small core of them? Or was it a growing core of them? Was it mostly the skilled workers? So let's take another question if somebody has one, and then we can go ahead, Nick.
So
Rebecca had her hand up too.
Okay, I'll take Nick and Rebecca, and then we'll get to let people respond. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks. The presentations were very inspirational. My question is, and it may sound like a negative one, but it's not meant to be. And it's what is it that failed, or in other words, not what failed, but why didn't it continue on and grow and become bigger and et cetera? My own experience, and I'm sure the experience of others, is you can have a very significant movement, but then it runs into something and it fails. And then you have, what's the lesson? So I'm trying to get at what are the lessons in terms of, how do you move that forward, or where was the problem area that prevented it from moving forward at the time?
My question builds sort of on that as well, is that in hindsight, are there things that you would have done differently that you think could have helped it to be more successful, or to have moved it forward? Of course, you wouldn't know then, but with the benefit of time, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Okay, let's turn to Phil. And Phil, you can start, and then John and Hillary and Samantha, you might want to jump in.
Okay, about the attempts to take what we did at Lucas Aerospace to other industries in the UK and so on. A couple of points there. We've always said, as far when the Lucas Aerospace campaign started to get profile, we used to get calls to meet other groups of workers whose plants were in jeopardy. And it was almost as though because we'd got some public profile, it was almost like we had the answer to everything. We've always said that the plan that we produced was born of its age. It suited our industry for the situation it found itself in at the time. What we were at pains to stress was it wasn't a blueprint that we were trying to impose on anyone else. So whilst there are some things which will be common in the process to any situation, I think the Lucas plan was definitely of its age. And what happened during that age was that the Lucas Aerospace Combine was not the only Combine Shop Stewards Committee in the land. We weren't the only setup that were receiving frustration and inactivity from the national trade union level. Just to give you an impression of how bad that was, if you had a serious dispute, say in Lucas Aerospace, and you followed the national procedures, with 6 manual and 3 staff unions, with all had separate negotiating rights, you had to go through 9 procedures to national level. And if you got anything out of it at all, which usually you didn't, it would be the lowest common denominator of what each union would go across. So there were lots of other combines in the land. Vickers, who are the Trident submarine manufacturers, they had a combine in those days who were very active. And there's been lots written about attempts at Vickers on Barrow, and that issue about Trident is still going on. Chrysler had a combine, Rolls-Royce had a combine, Clark Chapman in the northeast had a combine. So there were a lot of combine shop stewards around who formulated Lucas-style plans in one form or another. And quite a lot of these are actually captured on different films which are going round, and looking back, that they're actually, it's very interesting to see what people did. So the model was adopted, you can't say on a wide scale, but on a significant scale by other combined shop stewards committees who were trying to anticipate difficulties. And I'd like to ask John to add to this in just one second. But I sent over to you, Sam, yesterday, a Nuclear Education Trust report. And it's a survey that Sam drew my attention to about 2 years ago. And it's an excellent report. And it looks at different countries in Europe, Africa, and around the world, and at attempts of not just factory conversion, but of community conversion as well, the struggles of communities. And it draws out conclusions which are common to the success of every struggle. So that's a report you might want to have a look at that I sent through to Sam yesterday. John, can I pass on to you now?
Hello everyone, thanks for the invite. Yeah, there were, as Phil said, quite a few combine committees. I know I went up on a couple of occasions up to Vickers myself. I met with the combine committee up there and the stewards to discuss options that were available to them. I had to say, but one of the negative things that happened around that time was the fact that C&D and other peace groups jumped on the back of the concept of socially useful products, and they started to chase up some of these combine committees and try to tell them how to run their unions, and actually caused a lot of friction between the two parties. One of the main aspects in all of this, though, is the fact that we recognise in our plan the need to upskill our workforce as well. So we actually, within the plan, had an employee development programme, actually called for a lot more female engineers to come forward and be developed into senior engineering roles. So it's forward thinking in that way as well. And so when you spoke to some of the other combine committees, they're very proactively trying to protect their jobs and their skills. I spoke to a convener in Derby at Rolls-Royce, involved in the nuclear power packs, who was quite anti combine, and this is only about 2 years ago. Had quite a difficult conversation, but as the conversation developed, I explained where we were coming from and the fact we recognised that upskilling was key to it. He got great pride in the work that they did. They got great pride in the fact that the nuclear power packs they were producing were the best in the world. And he recognised they wanted to keep the skills, but he also recognised that they won't last forever, and they needed to also look at conversion or diversification in some ways. And the latest thing I heard from them was that they were looking at developing small nuclear power packs for the home. So you can look at conversion, and some of you will think, in horror, that's the last thing we want, a nuclear power pack to run in the house. But on the other hand, it's a case of diversification as well, not necessarily some would call socially useful. So the other thing that, Phil, you may remember that some of the product ideas that came forward, we knew that we couldn't make and were not suitable for us anyway, but we passed on those ideas to those combines where their factories could produce them. That was one of the things that we tried to do, is to share the ideas around, to say to other sites, well, we couldn't possibly make this product, but it's something that maybe you would want to take forward going forward. And the last observation I'm making is, as we've seen around the world with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, in the UK overnight, factories were converting from what they were producing to make ventilators within 24, 48 hours, using the skills and technology of the workforces. So we've actually seen PPE being developed. We've seen that where there's a will, there's a way, and it's about companies having the political pressure put on them to follow those conversion ideas through. I think that answers those questions. Obviously, we've got to come back to the other issue of what would we do differently. I don't think I would change anything at the time. We did everything right. The only thing that we could have changed, we would like to have changed, but we got no control over, was the attitude of the senior union officials. They're the ones that helped to destroy and bring the combine down eventually, working with the management.
Okay, thanks, John. Sam, did you want to jump in? Samantha?
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody. I think I'd just add one thing in the sort of current context. I mean, I think what was really interesting in 2016, obviously just a little bit prior to that, when we were looking at organising the conference on the Lucas Plan as a commemorative event, but also to learn from the Lucas Plan and how we could apply it to the multiple crises that we're facing today, and which Phil said has, pre-existed, but have become more urgent. But I thought what was quite shocking, see, I was 10 when the Lucas corporate plan was produced, and it's been the backdrop. So for my trade unionism, it's always been there in industrial history, and people celebrated it, talk very fondly about it. And I was absolutely shocked when we were trying to mobilise unions to get engaged with the conference, that the immediate response was, well, why? That failed, and was really quite dismissive of it. So I think really, as Phil has summed it up very well, I mean, it's not a question of it failed. It was failed by the trade unions and the Labour Party at the time. But I think what's really interesting, if we look in sort of 2020, 2021, and we still need that new trade unionism, and in more critically so perhaps than ever with all the urgent things that we're facing. And we very much came across this. I think I shared with you, Sam, a report we did last year around the aviation sector. Now, obviously, the jobs in the aviation sector have gone globally, and you know, a bit like obviously with GM Oshawa, they tend to create this sort of company towns around the airports because workers are so dependent on them. But it was incredible trying to get unions to work together last summer to actually come to common positions about how both saving jobs and both looking at alternative routes for workers out of that. And it was very much a kind of, you know, unions for themselves. So the airline workers were just going to look after the pilots. And if they save some jobs of the pilots, that's all they cared about. You know, some of the cabin crew. It's, you know, it was a real lesson in that, you know, we perhaps haven't learned anything as a movement. And now we're in with the global climate crisis and all the discussions around just transition and how you move, you know, just largely been focused on the fossil fuel sector. I think our big challenges is actually how do we think differently within a trade union and labour movement to actually have the conversations and the organising and the rank and file organising that we need to come up with the alternative corporate plans, because we are continuing to just negotiate on the boss's terms, frankly. But there's a lot of interest around it now. And as we did form this new Lucas Plan group out of the conference in 2016 to help sort of obviously promote the ideas of the Lucas, former Lucas Aerospace workers. And it's been great to have people like Phil, John and Hilary around still that can come to our many meetings and give the first-hand experience of all this. But I think at the end of last year, as a group, we felt quite pessimistic, really, that we hadn't achieved very much over these 3 years since the conference in embedding some of these ideas or getting some of these planning processes perhaps underway. And I think, and you know, sort of coupled with the specifics of the political situation in the UK at the moment as well. But I think we were doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice because it has become very much part of the discussion, and lots of young people, you hear the Lucas Plan thrown into lots of debates now, you'll see it come up in the chats of meetings, you know, so it's out there, the ideas are out there, and now it's how do we mobilize around that and get into the rank and file, and we're still not at that point, unfortunately, but that's something we, you know, I think we need to feel hopeful about, but start to think differently about our trade unionism and what we're calling for, and particularly within the public ownership terms as well. So I'll just shut up there.
Thanks, Sam. I want to ask a couple of fairly concrete questions, but I want to get to this big question that you're all leading towards. So let me just raise them, and then other people might want to raise something, and then we'll let all four of you jump in and give your opinions. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about, for example, Samantha, how is it that you're working in a public sector union that's made such a commitment to this, a leading commitment amongst unions? I'd just like to understand that better, because usually public sector workers seem to be, you know, if they're good, they'll be supporting the private sector doing this, but they don't seem to be thinking about conversion too much. And then just going back to you, Phil, earlier, I'd like to hear more about this relationship between white collar workers and blue collar workers that you've spoken positively about. And I think the point that John raised that I think is so fundamental, which is that even when workers get involved in talking about social use, and conversion, it tends to be about what's good for themselves. And that's a lot different than the point he was making about recognizing, well, maybe somebody else should be converting this project because we're really not set up for it to be. We have to think about this in a class and in larger terms, which gets me to my main question, which at some point I'd like to hear about. It still is hard to expect unions, which are so fragmented and so busy doing their own thing, even if they create some space, taking this on themselves. You know, the question of a socialist organization taking this on seems so fundamental to change the unions and to supplement them, because socialist organizations, this is what they're supposed to be thinking about. And I'd like to know how that relates to momentum. Is there a sign that momentum sees this as an opportunity that it can carve out and play a positive, supportive role? Or is that just still very distant? So those are big things. Before we turn it over to all of you, I would like, is there anybody who wants to raise a few more specific things? And I think we'll just turn over the end of the last half hour or so to the four of you to elaborate on this. Is there anybody from else who wants to jump in? I can't see everybody's hands. Anybody? Wait, just before we get to you, Hillary, I'm going to let you get in. Okay, Simon, why don't you jump in? Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Samantha, Phil, Hillary, for your presentations. I actually have a copy of the book here, so I'm making my way through it. The new edition as well. And I'm on the youngish side, so I wasn't around for the Lucas plan, but I work with a group called Labor Against the Arms Trade, which is trying to mobilize labor opposition to Canadian arms exports to Saudi Arabia, but then talking about arms conversion at the same time. And the question I have, and maybe I don't know who's best positioned to answer this, maybe you, Phil, is that you said that the Labor Party leadership was lukewarm to the plan, if not hostile, that the trade union leadership was, the trade union bureaucracy and the leadership of the unions that represented workers at the various sites of Lucas. To what degree was the broader community in which the plants were located supportive of the plan? And could that, and was that leveraged as a kind of counterweight to the hostility of the labor leadership and of the union leadership? Or could that have been leveraged?
Okay.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just see if there's another question, and then I really would like to, and then we can just turn it over to whatever parts of this everybody wants to raise. Anybody else? I don't see anybody else, just, I can't see every hand, so, okay. Why don't, I don't see anybody jumping in, so why don't we turn this over to the group, and I'll let you all jump in and answer whatever you want, and then some of you can just speak again and even have some exchange amongst yourselves. We've got some good time to hear from you. And if this spurs some new questions, we'll pick them up too. Hillary, why don't you start, because you were anxious to get in.
Yeah, no, I was just anxious to answer Nick's question about the GLC, and then I'll say something about the question of the union blockages and what's happening now. So Nick's question was, what exactly was the people side of the GLC? Was it just a group of people, elected councillors, doing this policy? I mean, actually, it was on the one hand an elected group, mainly on the left. I mean, the left had worked hard in the London Labour Party to gain the positions of elected councillors, to be nominated, and then they stood and then they won. But then they recognised that they needed support from a politically appointed, we were called officers, because the whole local government setup is very based on a sort of military hierarchical model, which we tried to dismantle. That was our alternative, our own internal alternative plan. So they then appointed people like me and Mike Cooley, and also a wonderful guy called Robin Murray, who actually worked in Canada for a bit, and then also, you know, people who'd been involved in this kind of alternative planning in Coventry, a guy who'd been a shop steward in Ford's, you know, so the appointment wasn't so much just of academic experts, but of people with practical experience. So that was important. And just on the local authority side of things, I mean, now there has been an attempt, not linked so much to conversion, but to do with economic policy in a town called Preston in the north of England, which faced unemployment, sort of neoliberal finance-driven projects that collapsed. And what they did was a very conscious strategy which could be used elsewhere. They used all the procurement powers, both of the council, but then they brought together what they called anchor institutions, you know, hospitals, police, the university, and pooled all the procurement powers of those public institutions to then contract to any contracting they did of products, you know, sort of pencils for schools or whatever it was. They contracted to cooperatives. So they used this as a strategy for developing cooperatives. Now, obviously, that could be related to some kind of conversion strategy. Just finally, I'll just say something about this union, the blockage the unions face, because actually, as part of this constant emphasis on getting hold of academics to work for the Combine, the Lucas Combine got a sort of grant from a social research council to have somebody work for them. So they got this money and then got me to work for them with Dave Elliott, who's a professor of technology at the Open University. And you know, what they one of the problems they wanted us to work on was the blockage from the trade union officials. And key to that, which has slightly changed now, I mean, Samantha might have more to say on this, but is that, you know, the key union officials actually saw the Combine as a threat to their power, because the Combine has an autonomy, it had power due to it bringing together workers from across the industry, you know, in different unions. So it had a power based on unity of different unions in a workplace that meant it was outside of the control of any one union. So that was the threat that it represented to a lot of those officials. Not all, I have to say. You know, the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, Ron Todd, was extremely supportive, as were many Labour Party members. So I think the point about the opposition was Labour Party leaders and trade union leaders, not amongst the rank and file, which most union conferences supported, you know, passed motions supporting the Combine. Now, just to look at the present situation very briefly, I'm working with workers in Rolls-Royce on alternatives to redundancies. And there, you know, the situation is that Unite, the union Unite, which has brought together most of the unions that in the days of Lucas Aerospace were all separate, you know, white collar workers, you know, draftsmen, technical workers, clerical workers, and then manual workers, are now all in one union. So the shop floor of Rolls-Royce, it's all, and the research department, it's all one union. And there, interestingly, the scientific and research and technical workers are kind of very much in the tradition of Mike Cooley. They're very radical. And they're the ones that have got this real sense that, you know, we're not redundant. Our skills could be useful. And the impact of the climate crisis is very powerful. And there, in a way, answering Sam's point about the role of organizations, political organizations outside the factory. There, it's a kind of not so much exactly explicitly socialist, but the Coventry Green New Deal, which is made up of eco-socialists. They are now working with Rolls-Royce shop stewards, so they've acted as a political stimulus to this interest in alternative plans. So there are developments now that are a little bit stimulated by the pandemic. And interestingly, these Rolls-Royce workers have themselves been involved in the ventilator, the development of ventilators from the aerospace sector. So there are these little seeds that, that I think that the kind of project that Sam Mason's talking about, the new Lucas plan, can build on, and is in touch with and involved in.
Thanks, Hilary. Okay, let's Sam, maybe you want to jump in at this point and just comment on whichever of the questions that came up, and then we'll go to John and Phil. So Sam, do you want to jump in now?
I'll just respond to your point, Sam, about how does a staff person in the union get to be spending their time on this? And to be honest, I spend a lot of non-staff time on it. A lot of the stuff I do around the New Lucas Plan is done in my personal capacity as a member of that group and as an activist. But I mean, my union supports the Lucas Plan. It's behind the kind of project in broad terms. But I think, like anything, it depends on leaders, doesn't it? Now, I've had a change of boss in the past 18 months. He's a great guy, but he's not really interested in this work. I'm not saying he doesn't support or understand it, but he's not going to be behind it in the same way that I've been able to sort of develop things in the past few years. So that's going to be a change. And lots of other things happening across the union. I'm not necessarily to bore this meeting with. So I think, that's just always one of the tangents to it. It depends on some of the personnel in the leadership positions of the union to do it. But I think what we struggle with now, and it's not just with sort of Lucas Plan type thinking and planning, but around the whole just transition stuff, which we've written tons on, is actually now applying that in an industrial way. That gets, I mean, even for PCS members, we have something coming up where we've got a publicly owned nursery, which the government is trying to shut down because it's being undercut by private contractors, etc. We just started a discussion last week of trying to get these members to sort of think, well, actually, there's other things that you can be doing in that nursery. So, but just trying very gently, because the officials as well looking after those groups of members, that's not in their thinking too. So we've got like huge amounts of education to do there. And just about a month ago, I had a discussion with our industrial officer who looks after our defence sector workers, which is on the civilian side. And and to be fair, he said to me, I didn't really get it a year ago when you were talking about all these alternative plans and why we had to look at defence diversification. And he said, well, I understand it now. And we had a really great conversation. But I mean, actually, a year's not a bad time for somebody to come to that sort of conversion in their thinking. But but we're not really at that point of even embedding it across our union as part of industrial thinking. Which is where last year, when we had the crisis in the aviation sector, was the first time we properly aligned around some of these ideas. It hasn't taken us anywhere at the moment, but we at least had an industrial officer who got it. We had the leadership of the aviation group that got it, so we could actually talk about these within the realm of public ownership. So I think it's. My union generally, I mean, it's against nuclear, it's against Trident, it's so it will stand on a platform for these ideas. I think that the point is like how you start to apply it industrially, realistically, is the difficulty right now. And of course, like all unions, we're firefighting stuff. So a lot of this has really dropped down the agenda with COVID dominating absolutely everything for the past 12 months, and it's hard to get anything else on that agenda.
Okay, thanks, Samantha. John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I could. My union, the union I belong to, Unison, is a public sector union. It's one of the biggest in the country. For the last, I retired 2 years ago, and I stayed on a couple of years. You know, I always brag that I'm the youngest of the remaining shop stewards, because I've got to my 69th birthday, and I'm the baby of the. I don't particularly look the youngest, but or feel it, but there you go. For the last 18 years, 20 years, I've been involved in the West Midlands Fire Service. And I just want to share a couple of thoughts with you about how, although 40 years ago I was involved in the plan, it never leaves you. It's part of your psyche in many respects. 3 or 4 years ago, my members, I was branch secretary, so I was like the convener of the West Midlands Fire Service, Unison branch. We were facing potential redundancies, and at the same time, our fire stations are classed as community fire stations, so they're there to serve the community. We recognise that local hospitals are having big problems. There's backlogs of patients waiting for hours to get a lift home from the hospital back to their house. The other thing that fire service has done nationally is to have a programme of prevention, so they've had firefighters going into people's homes and carrying out safe and well visits, making sure that the environment's safe, that they haven't got any particular underlying health issues, that if there was a fire they could get out, and all those sort of things. And they started sending firefighters around people's houses carrying out this safe and well. So I put forward a proposal that our staff, support staff, non-uniform, could actually go to the hospital, pick people up, take them home. So instead of waiting for hours, it frees them up from the hospital, take them home and carry out the safe and well, freeing up firefighters to remain on the front line. And we did that for 18 months, and we got the NHS to actually pay towards some of that cost, and it saved the jobs for that period of time. It changed the management mindset into the role of support staff. We had pins, we had badges produced saying we are front line, and I argued that you go into a business, the first person you see is a receptionist. We're front line, and we had a campaign around that. We saved the jobs, and that change in policy resulted in staff being promoted up into different roles. During the pandemic, 100 of our members, our non-uniform staff, have been trained up to deliver vaccinations. So the mindset of the fire service changed. The other thing I did in the last 3 or 4 years of my working life, I recruited most of the managers to join the union, and set up a management section, and got them to elect their own representative, which makes it very difficult now for the senior management team to actually attack members, because a lot of them are actually managers. They're in sort of potential conflict. And again, it's changed the mindset of the managers on how they deal with and work with their colleagues, their staff. So there are strategies that can be brought in that are created by thinking outside the box. Now, because of all that activity, when I was coming up to retirement, and Phil, myself, Brian, started to put together our own website, I was proud to say that my branch actually sponsored and funded for that website to be created. Now, because we've got the Unison badge on the Lucas Aerospace Combine website, we've had lots of support from within Unison itself, and the word has been spreading around Unison. Now, it's led to something else that's been happening Sam mentioned the Green New Deal, or Hillary, sorry, mentioned the Green New Deal in Coventry, working with Rolls-Royce. I think that's a platform that could be built on in our country as a strategy in different areas for giving the political support for conversion policies taking place. Now that the SAMS group, the New Lucas Plan Group, can work strategically with them to perhaps give them the guidance and infrastructure, help with the infrastructure for that to happen. Because one thing that came back, Phil, years ago, you remember with the Labour Party that we were looking at, was the setting up of conversion centres. And I'll let Phil speak a bit about that, if you don't mind, Phil.
Yeah.
But one thing that's happened in the last 2 or 3 months is that in Manchester, Unison were involved in taking part in a conference where we're looking at the use of our pensions, our local government pension funds, to create jobs and protect jobs in the local economy. So in the West Midlands, we've got a local government pension scheme where we all pay into our pension fund, and we're challenging the use of where those pensions and that fund is being invested in and used. We can't see why that can't stay local to protect local jobs and help in the conversion of green industry. Our mayor has launched a programme of using local bicycles, electric bikes, but they're coming from a company called Uber, which is a Tory party benefactor, not being made by local businesses in Birmingham and the West Midlands that could produce those bikes. So there's going to be a battle taking place there, and this is where I'm coming finally, Sam. The one thing that we're trying to do, I'm certainly involved in, is trying to get support from within Momentum to bring the political argument forward for local economy support as well. I think we have to call upon, wherever there's a voice, to bring us some sort of coherent strategy together on a local level to protect those local jobs or create new ones.
Thanks, John. You know, just when you're speaking, it just occurs to me how important it is that we're struggling with how to create new spaces that are outside of profitability and especially competitiveness. And what we often don't spend enough time thinking about is that the public sector is already supposed to be out of those spaces, but we don't think creatively about it. And what you're pointing to is there's a lot of space to democratize the public sector in terms of how it relates to the community, but also in expanding its vision and ambitions about what it can do. And then it raises this interesting question of what do you do locally and what has to happen more nationally? There's a way of balancing the two. So yeah, no, that's great. Okay, Phil. Phil, just before I put you on, I'm just wondering whether anybody wants to add another question, because I think we'll probably wrap up with Phil. Does anybody want to add another question? No, I don't see any. Nick?
It's been alluded to, but I just want to if we could contextualize today compared to the time mid 1970s in Lucas. The Lucas Plan. It seems like both Greater London Council and the Lucas Plan arose with a crisis in jobs. And it was responding to that. Today, there are other crises coincident with those types of crises, in particular the climate crisis, but also the pandemic, of course. And I'm wondering what that does in terms of thinking around how to deal with these options. I know it's been talked a bit about the Green New Deal, and I know it's a pretty general and vague question, but I'm thinking of that context and how you apply that context to your thinking today.
Yeah, very good, Nick. I think when we were meeting as Green Jobs Oshawa, it really was the question we kind of ended up with wanting to hear more about. So it's a good place to take it now. So Phil, why don't you jump in with everything you've kind of got piled up there, scribbled to comment on, and then maybe anybody else from England can jump in on the question that Nick is raising. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, that's fine. I will jump around. I have a few things written down. On the last point that Nick's just raised, as the famous man said, progress arises out of conflict. And on COVID specifically, changing the world, there have been a number of webinars that we've been involved in, some particularly on the issue of COVID and conversion and the opportunities that presents. And many of those are recorded. So that's been something that's been debated here nationally. And some of us have made contributions to the discussion around that. If you want to follow up the discussions, because there's a lot of good stuff came out of those, I can supply you with the links. John asked me to pick up on the idea of a national conversion centre, which I'll do in a moment. But I'll just try and pick up some of the points that were raised as we went along. Sam, you mentioned about the relationship between white and blue collar workers in combine organisations. In Lucas Industries and the wider group, in Lucas Aerospace and in the wider group Lucas Industries, there was a very distinct division between manual and staff workers, and the company went out of its way to divide and rule. The conditions were different, particularly the pension schemes. There was a big difference between the staff scheme and the manual workers scheme. And one of the things the Combine did before the plan was even thought about, they set about a campaign to harmonise within Lucas Industries the manual workers pension schemes and the staff's pension schemes, and also to facilitate that process to get trustees on to the pensions trustee board. There were 7 trustees, all nominated by the company. The manual and staff unions, and they included the official unions as well, ran campaigns based on the British Great Train Robbery, where the robbers stopped the train and got away with millions. They stuck up posters all around the factories saying the great train robbers got away with 2 million. The Lucas pension trustees are plundering to the tune of about £35 million per year, which was perfectly legal when the pension fund was in surplus, and I believe it still is. So the upshot of that was that the staff had to accept to stand still in benefit improvement to their scheme, while the manual workers, to use simple terms, caught up. Now that did a whole lot for developing the relationship between the two. It did more for the manual workers in their appreciation of staff than it did the other way around, as you can imagine. But that was one victory. And even before we left, the pension scheme was harmonised. And the Combine Shop Stewards Committee in Lucas Aerospace played a fundamental role in that, providing 2 of 3 trustees on the board. Also, one of the things the Combine brought in was a science and technology advisory service. So, for example, a new welding technique was introduced. The workers said, does it give off phosgene gas, which is poisonous? The company said no. They went through to experts through the Combine Science and Technology Advisory Service, got the answer, got the references, got the scientific paper. Yes, it gives off phosgene gas. You've relied. So all of those, there were a number of those campaigns that were won by the Combine, and all of those were steps in forging a relationship. The staff workers for years had been paid, but some of the staff workers, some of it like work study, had been paid by the company to exploit the manual workers, giving them times. And then, because of the introduction of computer-aided design and so on, the white-collar workers were exploited in the same way that they used to exploit the manual workers. So there was a massive growth of white-collar trade unionism in the 70s. I mean, John and I did, I've done 3 lecture tours of the United States, and John and I did one of those together. And people found it very difficult to believe that, first of all, in most British industries, there was almost 100% membership, blue and white collar workers. And some of our members in AUEW TAS, they went right up to personnel managers. So there was an inside track developed where the white collar workers were able to feed useful information to the blue collar workers. So that there was real hard evidence of this symbiotic relationship developing between the blue and the white collar workers. I'm not saying it was a cakewalk. The senior shop steward for the elite sheet metal workers, an old guy called Jack Brunton, used to say at every meeting, when I clock in, 3 staff men jump on my back, referring to the overheads he was carrying. So that there was still all that. I'd like to call it banter, but it actually wasn't banter. It was a bit more well meant than that. So that was sort of how the relationship developed, and changing technology fostered that development. On some of those speaking tours around the States in the late 70s and 80s, I met with we met, John, didn't we, with the Quincy shipyard workers, where we ran a meeting there when they were talking about closing the Quincy shipyards. I met with the workers at Lockheed Sunnyvale missile plant. They were a hard bunch. I addressed a meeting in Capitol Hill underneath the Stars and Stripes. At that time, a bill was being proposed called the Defence Economic Adjustment Bill, and it was drafted by a good friend of mine, Professor Lloyd Dumas, who's just retired from the University of Texas at Dallas. And that set out, that was a proposed statute to give workers in American arms producing factories the statutory right and funding to draw up Lucas-style plans as a contingency. I addressed the meeting, and it was chaired by Congressman Chris Dodd, who's still around. And he was nudging me, saying that those 3 guys at the back, they're right-wing hawks, but they've come because they're interested. Because whenever there's a defence cancellation, their chances of being re-elected go down a bit. The Defence Economic Adjustment Bill it was never passed, but failed by smaller majorities. And it's one of the most impressive pieces of proposed legislation I've ever seen. And Hillary and I did an article on that for her Red Pepper magazine. I still think there's a place for that. And whilst that failed at federal level, there were states like Minnesota, and I think it was Pennsylvania, that passed mini versions of the Defence Economic Adjustment Bill. I think that still has a role. One guy, I don't know, he's quite prominent in the conversion movement, is an American called Jonathan Feldman. Anybody know him? He's based in Stockholm. He is a mine of information on conversion. You might like to establish links with if you haven't already. And there's an English guy called Steve Schofield who is in a similar position. So I brought some of those ideas back to this country and others who went to the States. And from that grew the idea of, well, why not have the Labour Party commit itself to a national conversion agency, which did it do, or it almost did, Sam? I'm not quite sure whether it actually became formal policy or not, under the Corbyn leadership. But in the 80s, the local authorities who were prominent in the local authorities nuclear-free zone movement, like Sheffield, like Glasgow and so on, and that still exists, they came to a conference we organised in Sheffield on proposals to establish a national and a local arms conversion units along the principles of what was called the McGovern-Mathias Bill, the Defence Economic Adjustment Act. And that's kind of hit the buffers now because of the change in government. But I still think that's a model, because to bring about realistic conversion, it needs to be part of a national industrial strategy with inputs and levels at a local level, I believe. And I'm just looking at the other thing, one of the questions was about I can't see it down, so I'll sort of attempt to make it up. What would we do differently? Or you can extend that by saying, if the Labour government had accepted the Lucas plan, what would have been the mechanism for implementation? Well, in the 70s, planning agreements along the lines of Germany became all the rage. Planning agreements were a way of sitting down with a company and actually agreeing as part of the collective bargaining process a 5 or even 10-year investment plan. People were trying to sell us the idea of worker directors on works councils a la German model, but we wouldn't touch it with a barge pole because of some of the comments I made in my remarks. But planning agreements would have been an almost ideal way of introducing the concept of socially useful production. If we'd have continued talking to the company, what we would have done would have introduced the products by a trade-off, that we would give them the detail of a product which would be profitable in the commercial conventional sense, and as a trade-off and with government finance, then also to introduce what we would call a socially useful product. So that was the mechanism that we envisaged we would use at national and company level to actually start implementation for real of the content of the corporate plan. That hasn't covered all the questions, but I think I've covered all the time.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we're at the end of our time. Thanks so much. That was stimulating, inspiring. That's just great. I'm sure people are going to think of a million more questions, and I hope we can do this again. Let me just say to everybody, there's been a few people mentioned things that were sent on from Samantha or Hillary or yourself. I've actually been hospitalized for the last week, but I got out last night. So I'm going to put some of those things together, and I'm going to distribute a lot of these links. So again, I'm really looking forward to staying in touch, and that was terrific. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.